Good day, and welcome to the program, The Healing Power of Poetry in and as African American Theater. This program is supported by a grant from Lift Every Voice. This award was made possible with the support of the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and Emerson Collective. Morgan State's Beulah M. Davis Special Collections Department was one of 50 institutions around the country chosen to participate in Lift Every Voice, Why African American Poetry Matters, a national public humanities program dedicated to enhancing appreciation of the extraordinary range and richness of the 250-year-long African American poetic tradition. Its principal objective is to engage participants in a multifaceted exploration of the tradition, the perspectives it offers on American history, and the struggle for racial justice, and the universality of its imaginative response to the personal experiences of African Americans over 3 centuries. Thanks again to the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, and the Emerson Collective, as well as 2 partners, the Library of America and the Schomburg Center for Black Culture. Good day again. My name is Dr. Ida Jones, and I am the University Archivist at Morgan State and the site coordinator for the Lift Every Voice, Why Poetry, African American Poetry Matters coordinator. Today, we will have a moderated conversation by Professor Kimberly Collins and panelist Dr. Sandra Shannon and Dr. Eugene B. Redmond. I'll introduce them in that order and then turn the program over to Professor Collins. Professor Kimberly A. Collins is an advocate for writing for healing and gave voice to the movement against domestic violence with her poem, Remember My Name, which became a staple of Domestic Violence Awareness Month observances. Professor Collins has facilitated writing for healing workshops for almost 30 years. Her inspirational weekly blog became the book Choose You, Wednesday Wisdom to Wake Your Soul. She attended Spelman College and holds a BA from Trinity University and an MA in American and African American Literature from Howard University and an MFA in Poetry from Spalding University. Collins is also a Callaloo Fellow, is a native of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, who lives in D.C. and teaches English and creative writing at both Morgan State University and currently at Howard University. The first panelist is Dr. Sandra Shannon. Dr. Shannon is Professor Emerita of African American Literature in the Department of History at Howard University. She is widely acknowledged as a major scholar in the field of African American drama and the leading authority on playwright August Wilson. Dr. Shannon was also the sole editor for August Wilson's Pittsburgh Cycle with McFarland Press in 2016 and the Modern American Drama Playwriting in the 1980s, Voices, Documents, Interpretation with Bloomsburg in 2018. She has taught and team taught undergraduate and graduate level courses and continues to organize annual conferences on Wilson's work and response to invitations to lecture on Wilson's American Century Cycle plays. As founder and current president of the nationally recognized August Wilson Society, which was established with Howard University's College of Arts and Sciences in spring of 2006 to honor the late playwright, she continues to organize annual national conferences and seek grant funding for the organization. In 2018, she was inducted into the College of Fellows of American Theater as a distinguished achiever in professional and educational theater. She was invited to be a key consultant and one of several scholars featured in the 2015 PBS American Masters documentary, August Wilson, The Ground on Which I Stand. Her co-panelist is Dr. Eugene Redmond. Dr. Eugene B. Redmond, Poet Laureate of East St. Louis, Emeritus Professor of English, and founding editor of Drum Voices Review, and former chairman of the Creative Writing Committee at Southern Illinois University, Edwardsville. He spent 2 years, from 1967 to 1969, as teacher, counselor, and poet in residence at Southern Illinois University's Experiment in Higher Education, where he taught with Catherine Dunham. In 2006, he coordinated the International Memorial Celebration for Miss Dunham. From 1970 to 1985, he was professor of English and poet in residence at California State University, Sacramento campus. During that time, he won an NEA Creative Writing Fellowship, an Outstanding Faculty Research Award, a Pushcart Prize, Best of Small Presses, and served as a visiting professor at universities throughout the United States, the continent of Africa, and Europe. In 1986, a year after he returned home to East St. Louis, local authors created the Eugene B. Redmond Writers Club in his honor.
I can say that I have been taught. Dr. Redmond, who I lovingly call Baba, has known me since the early 20s, and when I first made my foray into poetry, and Dr. Shannon as a professor of English at Howard University.
He put me in the history department.
Steered me towards my completion. And in fact, one of my favorite projects I actually completed in your class, which is about the female playwrights. I can't remember the book I put together, but it was really creative.
Wow.
So yeah, I thank you both for that.
Yeah.
I have to say that I was actually really surprised that both of these, Wilson as well as Dumas, were poets first. And so my first question is, well, why do you think, and either one of you can answer first, why do you think poetry was their first medium before they went into fiction and playwriting?
Well, in Wilson's case, I don't think he had figured it out that way. As poetry being the first, it was a process of discovery. I do remember him saying that poetry had an innate dramatic impulse. Mm-hmm. It was embedded in poetry. But early on, he was just fascinated with the sound of language, more so than the meaning of words. That's how he got into it. This was around the same time of Amiri Baraka in the 1960s. Baraka was a mentor, an icon for him, but he did not follow Baraka's type of poetry. He was more interested in the sound of words, whereas Leroy Jones was talking about the power of words or putting words into action. So August Wilson, I don't think, had a map saying that I'm going to be a poet and now I'm going to be a playwright, and as well as a fiction writer. In some of the interviews I've had an opportunity to speak with him, I learned that he did write fiction, and I had an opportunity to speak to his wife, Constanza Romero, who also admitted that he was a fiction writer, quite good at that. So he has work, I understand, in multiple genres. And of course, I'm very anxious to visit the University of Pittsburgh, which recently acquired his papers, his archives. And in those archives are early poems. I don't think anybody has done a collection of his poems, so there's a project there.
Yeah, that's a question later on.
Yes, but he had a lot of poems, unpublished poems. He also dabbled in fiction.
Yeah, in fact, this book that I have, the August Wilson 3 Plays, where in the preface he starts talking about himself as a 20-year-old poet who actually started listening, who stumbled upon one of Bessie Smith's songs, and that's what made him kind of open up to other ways to perhaps tell a story.
Absolutely. With Bessie Smith, he was a young man in his 20s, born of mixed parents. His mother was African American, his father was German white man, and reportedly did not have a whole lot to do with the family. So Wilson basically came of age in the 1960s. And so Bessie Smith spoke to him in ways that no other writer had. It's specifically the blues. It's the blues aesthetic. And I think that book that you just held up, Professor, has an essay in the back of it by Paul Carter Harrison called The Blues Poetics.
Yes.
August Wilson and the Blues Poetics. So I think the blues became somewhat of a conduit and a window for August Wilson to enter through not only in terms of coming to grips with his own racial identity. You know, he realized that at that point he had more affinity with his African American mother's cultural heritage than he did with his father's. And so that particular recording spoke to him in those ways. There are a couple of epiphanies that Wilson shared in a number of interviews. And another one of those epiphanies, about becoming a poet and then a playwright. Early on, before he left Pittsburgh, August Wilson is a Pittsburgh native, he had begun to write a series of poems. And he titled that series of poems Black Bart and the Sacred Hills, which was a 54-page sprawling series of poems. And his friend, Claude Purdy, who was also from Pittsburgh, had left and had moved to Minnesota. And he sent those to Claude Purdy, their collection of poems about this Black cowboy who had become an alchemist or gold maker, finding ways to make gold. And his friend Claude Purdy saw talent in it. So he gave August a bus ticket, I don't know, from Pittsburgh to Minnesota, but that's another story. But anyway, he gave Wilson transportation money, I'll put it that way, to come from Pittsburgh to Minnesota to basically study to become a playwright. So there was another epiphany there, another light bulb going off. So it was a gradual process of being in love with language, of being really moved by the blues aesthetic, really searching for his own identity, his racial identity, his cultural identity, realizing in the poetry that sort of dramatic impulse, it was always there. And also, I interviewed him in 1991, and one of the first questions that I asked him, and I have it here in my book, The Dramatic Vision of August Wilson, I said, the following lines come from your poem entitled For Malcolm X and Others. He has a poem about Malcolm X, which was published in 1969 in the Negro Digest. I'm just going to read 2 or 3 lines of this poem. This will give you a sense of the kind of poetry that Wilson was writing in 1969. The hour rocks a clog. The midnight term in bones no shape before has warmed in such that loves these cold as dead as stone. A flock of saints run ground as thieves. And then he writes in another poem, which he calls an African praise song or praise poem about Muhammad Ali. He writes, Muhammad Ali is a lion. He is a lion that breaks the back of wind, who climbs to the end of the rainbow with 3 steps and devours the gold. Muhammad Ali with a stomach of gold, whose head is iron. And I asked him, what do these 2 poems suggest about your early years as a poet? And right after he laughed, he said, well, one idea was that I was writing obscure poetry. Certainly first, it actually took me till 1965, from 1965 to 73, before I could actually write a poem that I felt was written in my own voice. So early on, he was still searching for that voice. At one point in his career, he admits to having been influenced not just by Amiri Baraka, but by the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas. And you get a sense in that verse that I just shared with you, the lyricism, it's not necessarily, literal, but you feel it, you sense it through the language.
Okay. And Dr. Redmond, you could, I guess, add a little bit too, since you knew both of them personally, Dumas as well as Wilson. What do you say in terms of how the poetry may have led them to the fiction, or what would you say about that?
You're talking to me, right?
Yes, yes.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was so enthralled. I am so enthralled by Dr. Shannon's deliverer.
But
I mean, such a mastery of all that is needed to convey the wit and the wisdom, the techniques of August Wilson, but all that is the best of whatever I've seen or heard of an English teacher.
thank you.
Really, really great.
I'm
So
training the
somehow
English
I missed
part.
the reference to me. But
Yes.
yeah, I think uh, the thing with both Dumas and Wilson mastered music,
Mhm.
and I say when people ask me the difference between black poets and white poets, I say, I list a zillion things, but I said there's no black poet who has not written a poem about lynching.
Mm.
There's no black poet who has not written a poem about music. And I could go on the rest of the time talking about what distinguishes black poets. Now, it's not that some other poets from other ethnic and racial persuasion don't write about it. But I mean, there's no black poet going back to Wheatley, whomever, that hasn't really written seriously about the defilement of the black body, and hasn't talked about sound. So that's something that both of them did so well. And we've I'm on another Zoom later today. You imagine that 83, the way I'm pushing. I've done uh, more than 75 Zooms since this
Wow.
coronavirus started. And
Wow.
I've done twice that many telephone conversations about what we're speaking. And so I'm at the ready, and this year, 2 books by Dumas will be coming out. But I wanted to say that we knew August as a poet, right?
Oh, wow.
As a poet. And so when they said this guy named Wilson's writing plays, and I said, who is it? Because who is he, And then I thought, oh, wow. You know, I thought, Negro Digest, Black World. I thought The Poetry of Black America by Arnold Adolph. I thought about all those different publications, that we started in the 60s and in the 70s and all the anthology. And I said to K. Curtis Lau one day, he said, well, poet. He said, the playwright. And I said, yeah. I said, he used to be a poet. That was just a conversation because he had made it so big,
As a playwright.
as a playwright that he used to be a poet. He used to be a poet. That's what he was doing. He was moving around as a poet, poets talking, right? And then Curtis said he used to be a poet. That he's a poet and a playwright in his plays. So so yes, I think and in something that I'm going to be talking about later, an event that I'll be speaking at later has a lot to do. It's the emphasis is on African futurism, known as Afrofuturism.
Mhm.
And I always say here in the last couple of years, if you're uncomfortable with the word juju, if you're uncomfortable with the word voodoo or voodoo, if you're uncomfortable with black magic, if you're and I go on, if you're uncomfortable with those words, now you have African futurism because that's what they were doing. That's what Dumas was doing,
That's right.
and and that's what August did before
Absolutely.
that name They called it magical realism, surrealism. In fact, Baraka himself referred to Dumas as a Afro-surrealist,
Well,
an underground deity. So, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. So,
let me jump in right there for when you said, because that was kind of feeds into the other question I wanted to ask. Do as you said, Baraka calls him an underground deity, mostly because it's only because of you and Toni Morrison being the editor at Random House that we even know of Dumas now,
yeah,
because he gains fame.
and a bunch of others, Eleanor Trailer,
Right,
who
but he
just became part of the cult. That,
right, he really gained fame posthumously, right?
yeah.
And so I wanted to ask about this underground deity description of him, and if you could explain that, and also how does that description extend to Wilson?
Well, in the same way, I mean, Wilson,
What is our underground deity?
yeah,
How do
the underground deity, they never initially they didn't attain any fame. Now Wilson went on to be, I mean, globally, the orb and drama, you know, I mean, across the world they were saying he's the Black Shakespeare, and there's no Black playwright who has ever achieved. Not Derek Walcott, whom the white people loved and we love, but nobody has gotten that far. And Pulitzers like that, and you know, um, just incredible. The kind of critical acclaim. So I think that he got it later. Dumas didn't get it until he died, and so that's what is meant by underground deity. It's that had it not been for the cult, the very deserved cult, in Morrison's words, might not know about him.
Mm-hmm.
If it had not been for Jane Cortez's carnage, um, the Henry Dumas movement, and then join the cult, so that all over the country and the world they were reading from his work.
Absolutely.
James Baldwin read from him. June Jordan read from him. We go on and on, and readings all over. So it helped salvage a reputation. I don't know of another example. I don't know of another example in our literature where somebody has become so formidable in their position in the literature and in the culture, but whom nobody knew when they were alive. I mean, even County Cullen and um, Claude McKay. I mean, it's Phi Beta Kappas and stuff. I mean, young, so they died, but you don't hear County Cullen's name as much as you hear Dumas.
Mm-hmm.
So he truly was underground, and of course, Baraka was talking about several levels there. Underground and that nobody knew him, and underground and as the man who lived underground is that he was so unique, so different. The great god Shango in the African sea reached down with palm oil and oozed out me. Who could crush the story of the creation into 17 words or 20 words? I mean, that's it. A whole book in the Bible is devoted to the creation.
Well,
And here's a couplet.
my
Go
my
ahead,
my introduction to Dumas is through his fiction, Ark of Bones.
Yes.
which has been compared to August Wilson's Joe Turner's Come and Gone.
Yes.
You were listing earlier the criteria. These are subjects that Black poets write about. And of course, I would add the middle passage to that list that includes lynching. But such masterful language, such poetic, lyrical. I felt it. It's moving and emotional to read that piece.
Yeah.
Often been compared to Joe Turner's Come and Gone.
It has.
That journey, and even Gem of the Ocean, where the character named Aunt Esther takes another character to the city of bones, which is essentially the site of memory of the middle passage. And it's so delicately and beautifully and lyrically in Dumas's hands. So I came to him through his fiction, but his fiction is imbued with poetry.
Very much so. Yeah, the Margaret Walker said, you know, quote, well, in fact, we quote her in the new edition of Echo Tree that's coming out. And by the way, Faber and Faber of England is acquiring British rights for the reprint of Dumas' Echo Tree. But Margaret Walker said, the first time I read Ark of Bones, the hair stood up on the back of my head.
I can relate.
And you said, I mean, you like.
No, Ark of Bones is a story I teach. I've been teaching for the last, I would say, 10 years, my freshman class. And I'm always intrigued by what they come up with. And because one of the things that I have been trying to figure out since Eleanor Traylor, taking Eleanor Traylor's class, and she introduced me to Ark of Bones, right? In fact, anyway, I don't want to go back that far. But with the steps, the 1944 and the steps 1977.
1619.
Right. But specifically in steps 1944 and 1977, one of my students, and I said, well, what do these steps mean? And, you know, I always tell them, find a nugget. And he said, well, if you divide 1944 from 1977, you get 33. And that's the year Jesus dies, but also the year that he's 33 when he dies.
Dumas was 33 when he died.
When he's killed by the New York Transit policeman. And so it brings me to kind of full circle about talking about these men as deities or as prophets, if you will, even in their work. Do you want to talk about that a little more as you build on how they discuss the African or use the African American narrative strategies like call and response, rememory in their work? Do you want to expand on that idea?
Yes. Well, you know, one thing that Ta-Nehisi Coates, whose father's generation, you know, came under John Henry Clark and Van Sertima and, you know, that Dr. Ben and others came along at the time that ASCAC was being founded. Everybody knows what ASCAC is. Somebody just mentioned it earlier. Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations, right. But we're using a quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates in both the Dumas books. And he said that what stunned him about Dumas' language was his ability to employ Black myth in the service of the creation of a story, a complete story of a complete humanity from the pre-Egypt Blackness through colonialism, past enslavement. And that's what the African continuum Du Bois, and so that's what happened. That's what both of them knew. I'm not sure how Wilson got to it. I know how Dumas got to it because he just got into it early, and he studied with some Yoruba priest who lived in Brooklyn, and he was stationed in the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, for a year in the Air Force, and so he was able that, and his going to Michaud's bookstore almost every day in Harlem, and there are stories by Dumas that we're certain reference Michaud's. I mean, even before he doesn't mention Michaud. And that was the Black cultural, the Black literary, the Black intellectual center of Harlem. And he was there all of the time. So, and then part of it, and I suspect with Wilson, I interviewed Wilson in the 90s, and I've never published it because we were in a hotel lobby eating, and there was a lot of noise, but I didn't know it was coming into the recording. And when I got to listen to the recording, all that noise, the shuffling of feet and the hum, in a big restaurant, all that interfered. So I haven't really gotten anybody to snatch that background out of it. But one of the things that Wilson says in the interview is that I asked him about his childhood and about his interest in men talking on stoops and women, and he said that one time he just walked by some men and they were arguing about how many stars there were in the sky. And he said, it's 5 billion. No, man, you wrong. They're only like 15 million. And that's a long way. Are we on? Are we still on?
Yes, we're still on.
Okay, so everybody froze. I couldn't see. Nobody was moving. That's why I thought maybe. Yeah. So anyway, those are the kind of things. The way Dumas could go so deep in such a short space. My little boy speaks with an accent. I must remember sometime to bend my head down and ask him the name of the country he comes from. I like his accent. Or oh, these cold white hands, they broke us like limbs from trees and carved Europe upon our African mass. Ooh, let us, like little black spears, bring out the piggy bay juju and bore our way. That underground deity again.
Right. So how would you stand on that, Dr. Shannon?
Wow, after that, I might need you to repeat the question.
Well, part of what I was saying was, how Wilson too performs as this, well, we can't say underground, but at least deity, and how he builds upon the African American narrative strategies, like
I think
memory or call and response.
Right. I think autoethnographer comes to mind when I think about August Wilson, because in his writing, he was really trying to come to grips with who he was, with his position in the world. As I mentioned earlier, basically growing up without a father figure, having to find his own way, having left formal education in the 9th grade, having basically self-taught himself, reading the classics, Wright, Baldwin, Ellison, in the Pittsburgh Library. So I don't think the answer to that is not a formal route to becoming prophetic. I think that's one of those things that you just born with that extra eye. In my years of research on August Wilson, I have not come across anything that would answer that question. And so I'm just left with the word prophetic. There are individuals who are just simply that much in tune to the world, very observant at what things happen, and had to be because he had to find his way. So I think his senses were heightened because he was using his poetry, his plays, to find out his place in the world. So that's why I use the word auto, and I use the word prophetic. And I'm thinking now, of course, with Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, which is set to premiere on the 18th of December, people are calling it prophetic and inevitably talking about how this play, which is set in 1927, still resonates in 2020. And I can't help but agree with that. And not only that play, all of his plays.
Yes.
So what he's doing basically has a lot to do with time. I know Morrison does a lot with time. Dumas does a lot with time. Interesting things with time, manipulating time and history. So what Wilson is doing, writing, he has completed 10 plays set in each decade of the 20th century. What he has often said is that in each of these plays, what he's trying to do is to underscore some of the mistakes that African Americans have made, just demonstrate them and use them so that they don't repeat those same mistakes. So there's something cyclical. I've heard the phrase the past as present to describe how he manipulates time. He is going back to address those gaps in history, in histories that Black people did not write. You know, situating plays, using his poetic license to situate plays in moments that he imagined. What did Black people do what were the lives of Black people like at that time? And oftentimes spot on with his depictions. I don't know, the short answer is prophetic. I mean, he's just has those special powers. And, once in a while we run across writers. They don't necessarily have to have PhDs or, a string of accolades on their titles. They're just born with that gift. In love with language, in love with Black people, using his language to embrace Black people, to instruct Black people, to underscore the nobility of Black people, which he often said that Black people, needed to understand that their culture is noble and that their lives were noble and worthwhile. So he writes plays about a garbage collector, raises this garbage collector up to be a tragic figure, tragic heroic.
Right.
So that we're empathizing with this family, this Maxim family. So he had a knack for doing that, manipulating time and just in love with language.
Okay. I have another question for both of you. So when people think about poetry, they think about it in terms of meters, lines, and forms. How do you situate their poem or their poetry within those parameters? And can you?
Well, if you go off of the love of language, stretching language beyond the literal, having that gift for the use of language to represent universal concepts. If you read, for example, this is I'm going to use this, Dr. Collins, as a segue to just a sample in how August Wilson uses metaphor, for example. That was one of the questions that I asked him early on. What kind of evidence is there in your playwriting that shows that you had a grounding as a poet? And he said metaphor. His use of metaphor, which I guess transfers to personified characters and objects. This is what he writes. There's a sort of a shaman-like character in Joe Turner's Come and Gone called Bynum Walker. He's described as a voodoo worker. He's the person who is responsible for communicating with Harold Loomis, who's basically lost his way after being captured 7 years by Joe Turner. You know, I was just giving a little bit of background, but this Bynum Walker is talking in poetic form. And he's counseling this young guy up from the South. Every girl he sees, he falls in love with him. And so Bynum talks about it. He says, the guy says, talking about, she a fine woman too. Got them long legs. Knows how to treat a fellow too. Treat you like you want to be treated. And so Bynum, and I would say that Bynum in some way is Wilson's alter ego in this instance. He said, you just can't look at it like that. You got to look at the whole thing. Now you take a fellow, go out there, grab a hold of a woman and think he got something because she's sweet and soft to the touch. All right. Touching's part of life. It's in the world like everything else. Touch is nice. It feels good. But you can lay your hand upside a horse or a cat, and that feels good too. What's the difference? When you grab hold to a woman, you got something there. You got a whole world there. You got a way of life kicking up under your hand. That woman can take and make you feel like something. I ain't just talking about in the way of jumping off in the bed together and rolling around with each other. Anybody can do that. When you grab hold to that woman and look at that whole thing and see what you got, why, she can take and make something out of you. Your mother was a woman. That's enough right there to show you what a woman is. Enough to show you what she can do. She made something out of you, taught you converse, and all about how to take care of yourself, how to see where you at and where you're going tomorrow, how to look out to see what's coming in the way of eating, and what to do with yourself when you get lonesome. That's a mighty thing she did, but you just can't look at a woman to jump off in the bed with her. That's a foolish thing to ignore a woman like that. Poetry, metaphor, imagery. Paints the picture in your mind, trying to explain the value of a woman to this young guy. So that's just one instance. And, you know, of course, in plays like Gem of the Ocean, where the 280, well, first of all, he makes a character 285 years old. On Esther, which is sort of like a recurring figure in 3 of the plays in the American Century Cycle, is first introduced, you call it magical realism or whatever you call it, but she's 285 years old. And Wilson, like Morrison, writes about her in a way that the reader eventually, the characters question, man, how can she get that old? But Wilson writes in such a way, presents her in such a way that we suspend our disbelief. That she represents the number of years that African Americans have been in this country. So he does the math too, Professor Collins.
Right.
We're doing the math with Dumas. So this character's age is commensurate with the number of years African Americans since slavery, the first slaves in this country, embodied in this metaphor, this walking, breathing, 285-year-old metaphor of Africa. And he had similar things with the piano lesson, where that piano embodies the ancestry. So that is the residual poet, not the residual, the still very much present poet, August Wilson, work at work. And that those examples are just a few of many. Just about each of his plays, you can in Fences, Troy embodies death and wrestles with death to demonstrate that he's not a victim. That's August Wilson using his skill or background as a poet to create this ominous figure. Troy didn't just lay in the hospital bed and suffer and whine and complain. When he starts telling his stories so that he doesn't appear to be a victim, he creates this figure of death and talks about having wrestled with death for 7 days and 7 nights. Even while his wife Rose in the background keeps saying, Troy, you lying, you lying, you lying. But that's the way he, agency. That's the way he gets empowerment, by creating this figure.
But if we talk about form, and I think about Fences and that blues song, I think about the Blue Dog. I think that blues song that kind of almost works as a verse, right?
Yeah, are you talking about with the dog? There's a song about an old blue. Yes.
Yeah, Old Blue. Yeah.
When they sing that song, that's at a very low point. You're absolutely right. When they sing that song, a very low point. Another point, since we're talking about Fences and the blues, is when Troy is sitting on the back step, holding his daughter in his arms. I mean, that moment, that picture of a man who's brought his love child home to his wife to raise because the mother of the child has died. And Rose is not having any part of it at that point. And he's outside talking to his baby girl. There's poetry in that. That's one of those moments when the blues gives way to poetry, when the language is so exquisite at that moment. And there are many moments where the language becomes exquisite.
So turning to you, Dr. Redmond, and this was really, I didn't really think about how timely this discussion is with Ma Rainey's, which of the plays is about to, is it Ma Rainey's? Ma Rainey's Black Bottom is about to premiere, as well as Henry Dumas's Knees of a Natural Man. That's about to premiere. Right. Yeah. So if you, and just flipping through it, there was one poem that I really liked. I did read Knees of a Natural Man, but I really heard the blues, since we're talking about the blues, with Grandma's Got a Wig. Now I peeped in the door. I know why Grandma's looking so good. Yeah, I think I know why Grandma's looking so good. Grandma's got a red wig, baby. She's swinging like I know she could. So that was one form that I was able to look at. We're talking about poems and form. Are there any forms do you think that you could situate his poetry in, or what? I'm gonna let you go with it.
Yeah, I think you got the epigrammatic approach. You got the the funkdom that he visits. You've got rhyming dozens. You've got creations like Hughes. I think of Hughes often when I'm considering Dumas, because for 2 or 3 different reasons, but at the center of the reasons, or akin to all of the reasons, is the way he, Dumas and Hughes, nuanced language. Hughes gave us the jazz poetry. He gave us the conversational poetry. He was a bridge between the dialect poets and, say, Sterling Brown and the poets of the 60s who intersected the magical the magical realists. And that's for Wilson, whether he had read a lot. I don't know if I asked him about that in the interview, but certainly Dumas. They were all writing around the same time. Morrison was influenced by, there was three co-first place male influences on Morrison. She had not read women writers when she first started. So the three were and are William Faulkner, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and Dumas. Trudy Harris has written deafeningly about the impact, as well as Eleanor Traylor having written the impact of Dumas on Morrison, especially Beloved. Where was Dumas born? Sweet Home, Arkansas.
Right.
Where are the men from? The men that dominate Beloved? Sweet Home. And there are other parallel. But I think it's almost like Hughes, who was very spontaneous, and Dumas has that characteristic. There's the nuggets like that Great God Shango or My Little Boy. The things that appear not to have been overly fashioned when he got the idea. After he got the idea, they're just things that sort of spill out, and he touch them here and there, maybe do some reconfigurations. Maybe stepping in or stepping out with the lines.
Would those
But
configurations be the Ikefs that you have in the book? The Ikefs and the Saba? Yeah, the Ikef and Saba selection.
right. He creates forms. Got those ideas, the African and Arabic, because he spent a year in the Arabian Peninsula in Saudi Arabia, right?
So what does Ikef mean?
What?
The Ikef?
Yeah.
IKEF. What does that mean?
Akef.
Okay.
Akef. It's I I define it as a jazz high.
Okay.
And I'm getting close to some things that were happening at the time, including marijuana. It was big, in our generation, and there were some things that were beyond marijuana. But I define it as a jazz high, but it's part kif, kef, akef.
Mm-hmm.
It's a merger of a way to talk about a never world and a way to talk about entering another world, a never world. And that's what you get in this underground deity, what you get in um, crossing lines and barriers and worlds, which is throughout Dumas and throughout Wilson.
I, I,
Al- Always something new. So it's like improvisation. And also, um, Dumas was very deeply into blues and knew the cosmic name. He was very close to Sun Ra, very deep in the blues, very deep into the spirituals. Jay Wright, who knew him well, said that only Langston Hughes, possibly. Now, Langston Hughes could have been Dumas' father. But Jay Wright said only Langston Hughes possibly knew more about blues and gospel and spiritual than Dumas.
Wow.
And Dumas is half his age, right?
Right.
Let's just remember he was 33 when he was killed.
Right.
So, but he says only Hughes maybe knew more about the core of our folk expression and experience. Then he said knew as much or more or as much as Dumas.
Wow.
That's quite a and you're looking at Dumas and Wilson working separately and what they achieved. It's quite a remarkable that underground deity again. I mean Wilson defining so much and producing so much, but going underground to do it.
And it also appears that both of them, I would say, there might be a challenge that both of them were deeply embedded in the blues tradition, and really bringing that out in their writing. And we're gonna have to go soon. And I love this conversation, but I want to ask one last question, which to both of you, and that is, how does the craft of poetry intersect with the craft of storytelling and playwriting?
Wow. Well, I mean, I know.
And I asked the question about craft because Wilson says, and I really just love this whole preface in this book where he talks about, he says, many writers anxious to see results often ignore the very thing that can produce them, craft with all its tentacles. So, which made me curious about how that intersection works, the craft of poetry and playwriting or storytelling.
Well, I think not being afraid to revise, I think that a lot of it just did not spill out of him. He worked hard at his craft. And I'm talking about his playwriting. Not sure, because the whole, there's so much to be done in reference to August as a poet, as I referenced earlier. There's so many questions to be answered in that vein. But in terms of the craft of playwriting, he took it seriously, worked very hard at it, took it personally as well. But I do think as well that serendipity, divine intervention, whatever you might call it, really led his career. I think Ma Rainey's Black Bottom was discovered out of a stack of scripts that were sent to the Eugene O'Neill Theater Center. Now, that time, Lord Richards was the artistic director. He just happened to pick that script. So there's a lot of, serendipity, divine intervention at work here. And add to that a very ambitious, bright, visionary August Wilson, who was more drawn to writing and the arts than he was to a formal education. So I think it was a perfect storm, but he took it seriously and he took advantage of those openings and the mentors that led him along the way. As I mentioned, his friend Claude Purdy saw talent in him. Lord Richards saw talent in him.
Yes.
Molded him, counseled him. Ma Rainey's Black Bottom almost never was, not just because, Richards may not have chosen it, but at that time, people wanted to make it into a musical. And August Wilson was counseled by Lord Richards, man, you don't want to do that. Right. So August stood his ground and made sure that this was a play because the subject matter was too serious, he thought, to convert it into a musical. So I think it's almost like the path's open for him. I don't mean to make it seem that easy, but there were a lot of things that happened along the way that he was prepared for. I think at one point he said, it's the kind of luck that you make happen. You make the luck happen.
Well, you have to be prepared for that luck.
That's right. Be in the right place.
And
yeah.
What would you add as a person who has taught poetry and the craft of poetry? I always go back to when I called you one time. I had sent you some poems, and you're like, "You're not reading." So what is it? You remember that? And
he remembers.
I had to go back. I had to go back to the woodshed. You know. So
yeah, I think I wrote you a note like that once.
yeah. So what do you think in terms of the craft of poetry? You know a lot about that craft, and how does that bleed into the craft of writing fiction?
Well, the music, the difference between a musical and music. And the Wilson's has a lot of music. And I understand how Lord Richard said, don't do a musical, but you must have the music, the ear. And discussing poetry and discussing music requires parallel languages. Yeah. You talk about sound, you talk about meter. This is both forms, formally. You talk about lines, you talk about lineation in both. Well, wherever you see these forms discussed, the tutelary, the language tutelary is almost identical.
Okay.
You can't discuss either without using some of what I just said. And there are about 30 more terms. They're almost identical. So music and what we started calling in the 60s, the songification. We came up with a whole new language. I mean, Carolyn Rogers, Amiri Baraka, Larry Neal, just Eleanor Traylor. We came up with a whole new language to discuss Black expressivity. And just like we recognize, okay, well, this didn't happen because that didn't happen. Or this is new. So what do we say? How do we talk about it? And we go on with the solar system, SOU. And there's so many approaches, the songify, and the levels on which you portray what you say about us. Songify and the medieval kingdom, Songhai or Songye. And Baraka and I even spelled it. Usually it's Songify or Songified. But we would sometimes play with the word Songhai, and it would be Songhify. Not Songify, but it's Songhify, or you get it? Songhify or Songhify. I mean, it's really, really a very complex, and the meaning, the definition is in the way you say it. And we know that, and when we're teaching this, when I'm teaching, I starting in the 60s, I taught all creative writing classes as if I was teaching Black students only, mixed in, Elliot, because there were levels in the 60s. Some of us were already adults, when the 60s blew. Then some were teenagers. Some already had degrees in white nationalism, as Malcolm would say. But some of us were very young. And so they, one thing in a way, I kind of regret it. I'm not sure how to feel about it, but I used to be able to say, well, if anybody in this class gets sick, in this department gets sick, any English department I ever worked, if anybody in this department gets sick, I can move in and teach Shakespeare. I can teach Dickens. I can teach Scandinavian, Scandinavian playwrights. 6 characters in search of an author. But if I get sick and everybody drops their head, who's going to teach Morrison? Who's going to teach Hurston? Who's going to teach Wright? Who's going to teach Jesse Fawcett? Now, many of the young Black scholars, I'm so happy. I have mentees who went through school studying Black literature, from high school to a PhD. I mean, the young man who replaced me was trained by my friends all the way from Tougaloo to Penn State, 3 Black scholars. But uh, some of us talked the other day about it. You can no longer, some of them cannot say that.
And that's
They can say, they can say that, they can say that some people in the department may be able to teach Black writers, but then some are not able to teach the Western canon. And I don't regret it that much, but I just, it was the way. I mean, we had come through studying the Western canon, right? What Malcolm called white nationalism, and so then I would go into a classroom to teach a novel, Bloodshot, because I just read it 20 minutes before I dashed out of my house for a class. What was I going to read all of Hurston? Well, when was I going to read all of Baldwin, when was I going to read that? I was at a top flight, white school.
right.
So when that blew up in our faces and the students said, we want Black information, Black culture, and we want Black people to teach it, and we want people who look like us to be on this campus. That's the story, how we got to this point.
And
So anyway,
uh,
sorry about that long-winded.
Sandra Sanchez and said the same thing, and that's that we have to cycle back and and actually make sure that African American studies and African American and diaspora studies and literature are still important, and that they are still taught in all of these universities, not just the HBCUs, which makes this conversation not only timely but important to really punctuate, if you will,
Yes.
the importance of keeping alive these conversations about African American literature.
Absolutely.
And how it tells the tale of our stories here in America. Because you read any of our stories or our plays or our poems, it's a way of charting our existence here and beyond the water. So
That's right.
I'm glad that we've had that conversation, and that we're going to share this conversation around to different universities as well as in public libraries, where people who need to understand the importance of keeping alive not just Dumas and Wilson, but all the other African American and African writers
African, yeah.
who have been part of our story here.
But I just wanted to say that in this moment, in this very moment, in this country, indeed in this world, this is a much needed conversation. And
Yes.
I am encouraged, I have to say, even with all of the ugliness that's going on around, I am encouraged with where we are as a people in terms of the literature and learning our history and our culture. And I think there is I don't want to say pivotal, I want to say a return to an emphasis upon that at this moment, an appreciation, a renewed sense of appreciation born of this moment. And of course, this moment, of course, we're talking about Black Lives Matter, we're talking about political landscape, we're talking about all of that in this moment.
Coronavirus
Yes.
and racial virus.
That's right.
Yeah, you know, in fact,
I agree, Dr. Shannon. I agree completely.
Yes.
I thank you all for this conversation, and especially there's been a lot of talk about Afrofuturism. So that we see that these writers who are, although no longer with us, we see that they fit in that canon too. I'm almost going to say that, you know, African American life is Afrofuturistic.
It is. In fact, that's what I'm going to be doing in another hour or so. I'll be doing it. But I think that if you could get a repeat, not a repeat, get a sequel to this, you know, where we go right into what Dr. Shannon just described, what's needed.
This moment.
And if I don't know if that could be another grant or whatever, but that's what I'm doing. I'm doing most of my Zooms is the whole idea from freedom to freedom. You know, do what we did initially.
That's right.
But add the ancient component and make sure, because a slave is never going to be able to come from that enslaved position to face someone with all these great civilizations and have some dignity unless the people who have been knocked down have an opportunity, one, to know that they came from civilizations upon which were built the other world civilizations, and that the other world knows it. And it's a concept I call freedom to freedom.
Yes.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
And that's what I'm doing on all these Zooms.
Dr. Jones?
Well, I could listen for hours, and I feel this was a very rich conversation, definitely in need of a sequel. It's almost a course in and of itself that we want to share with the general public who will not matriculate through college classrooms. So that's a great part of this grant. And I definitely will probably entertain you again or approach you again to think about a part 2 as we go into 2021. And there's so many anniversaries and celebrations coming up with Harriet Tubman's bicentennial birth and other things along those lines to be reflective. But I want to thank you on behalf of Morgan State University and the Beulah Davis Special Collections, Dr. Redmond, Dr. Shannon, and Professor Collins for sharing your expertise with us and looking at the synergy between the African spoken word, African American theater, and African American poetry. There is such great power there because words do have power, and everything was brought into creation by spoken word. So words do have power. And I think our young people need to learn that, and they're desiring this. But it is also a depth of word to go into the actual word itself, to go through those dimensions of spirit, ancestry, and accountability as an heir. So there's where that kind of ties into what is responsible. So I want to thank you also very much, and we look forward to a robust question and answer period as time allows in the next sequence of our presentation. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you. All right. Good seeing you again, Eugene.